Hi, my name's Daisy Abbott. I work at the School of Simulation and Visualisation at the Glasgow School of Art, and today I'm going to give a short presentation on playful interludes, what they are and how they can help you in your teaching. So firstly, what is an interlude? This word simply means a short break from the ongoing activity that is designed to support the overall goals of your session. So it could be anything from increasing engagement with the students. You might want to change the tone, move into a different kind of activity. You can also use them to increase focus and, of course, to consolidate learning. And the most familiar interlude that you might know of already is an icebreaker. Why use interludes? Well, there's a lot of evidence to show that they can complement your existing learning content. They can enhance your intended learning outcomes, and they can increase active learning and deepen engagement with the students. And this is really the most crucial point, I think, is that it's a way to wake your students up and to really kind of get them engaging with the material, but in a way that is designed to enhance the outcomes of the session. Interludes can also help in terms of personalised learning. You can give control over to the students to allow them to approach a task in the way that is most suitable for them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. In the context of hybrid learning or online learning that we're all being asked to do a bit more of, I think it's particularly challenging to actually maintain the focus and the concentration of the students on the learning material. I think we all know that a 2-hour Zoom session is pretty fatiguing. So interludes can be a way to really kind of focus this attention back onto the teaching material and the learning outcomes. And I'm going to give some of my ideas about how we can do this in a hybrid or online learning situation. But feel free to get in touch with me at the email above if you have any ideas of your own. I'd love to hear them. Okay, playful interludes. So why make your interludes playful? Now, here I'm drawing heavily on this book, Playful Learning, edited by Nic Whitton and Alex Moseley. And in particular, I'm looking at the chapter called Playful Interludes, which is by Liz Cable. So I've drawn together a lot of the material from that chapter into this session, and I've also added some of my own ideas. But very briefly, play is a way to inform and engage and influence. It can also, very importantly, create safe spaces to try things out for students, to try creative approaches, to experiment, to try out a bit of practice that they perhaps wouldn't have the confidence to do in a more serious situation. And of course, it allows safe failing. Playfulness can also facilitate active exploration. It can help with social interactions and bonding, another particular challenge of teaching during the pandemic. It can help with resilience, and frankly, it can also help with motivation. If you make something playful, a bit fun, people are more likely to actively engage with it. Okay, so we're going to look at 4 types of interlude today, and they are the icebreakers, the group builders, the energizers, and consolidation. Firstly, icebreakers. This is probably the one you're most familiar with already, and depending on how you feel about them, you may approach icebreakers with a certain amount of dread. There are certainly some very, very bad icebreakers out there. But what is the purpose of an icebreaker, broadly speaking? It's to provide introductions, to break the ice. But it's not just about knowing somebody's name. Icebreakers can be used to provide introductions for the specific activity that you're doing. So it doesn't have to be about pointlessly learning people's names. It can be learning about their roles, their jobs, or their skills as well. You can also use icebreakers to really fix or set the tone of event, or to change the tone of event if you're moving from one kind of activity into another. Playful icebreakers can really bring a sense of creativity and fun to the session. They obviously can provide social support. They help your students to bond with each other and to bond with the tutor. And they can also create deep engagement with the material. So we need to think critically about all the interludes that we include in our teaching. So I've just outlined a few considerations here for icebreakers. How will it help people get the most out of the session? What do you need people to know? What do you want people to know about each other to enhance their engagement with the task that they're about to do? Is the icebreaker safe and inclusive for all participants? And I'm sure we can all think of some examples that aren't. So we need to make sure and really think critically about our icebreakers. Are they inclusive for everyone in the class, bearing in mind that we don't know our students very well at the point that we're going to be using icebreakers? So there's always a consideration here about providing the option to engage and the option of how to engage. So it's recommended that you allow for, or that you explicitly create different kinds of roles. So you allow people to be observers or rapporteurs, or something that perhaps allows them to opt out of anything they might feel uncomfortable with, and to engage in the mode that they prefer. The final consideration here is, does the tone and pace of the icebreaker match what you actually want from the activity? If what you're wanting here is some social bonding, then you need to have something that encourages students getting to know each other. If you're more task focused and it's about solving a particular problem, you might want to concentrate on certain skills or roles. So does it match the learning outcomes for your activity? Here's a terrible icebreaker. I stand at the front of the room, the students, and I say, tell me the most interesting thing about yourself, starting with you. And I point at some poor student in the front row who will never sit there ever again. It's very stressful, this kind of situation. I'm sure we've all been there. In terms of better icebreakers, I've proposed a couple of examples here, but I'm sure you've got loads of ideas of your own. But the idea is to bear in mind that people are different and people will want to engage in different ways. So an idea for a task-based icebreaker might be to use serious Lego play. You put some Lego on the table in front of people and you say, use this to build up a challenge that you faced at work. And then the icebreaker continues with them describing the challenge and perhaps giving it to somebody else next to them to help them solve that problem. So that's an example of a task-based icebreaker. Social-based icebreakers, there's loads and loads of them. You know, people do very silly ones. I've had people suggest naming their favorite kind of cheese. Are they a cat or a dog person? In an online environment, you can ask people to post an emoji based on their living situation, their family or their home. That can break the ice, but in a sufficiently abstract way that people don't feel like they have to share more than they're comfortable with. Or you could use a collaborative online space, you know, Padlet or Mural, or one of these kind of visual tools that we have access to share information about yourselves based on a prompt, depending on the tone of what you want. So you can add these introductions in the online space, and it gives people the chance to share as much as they're comfortable with, without the pressure of somebody pointing at them and saying, who are you and what are you like? I'm going to use this on my course, and I've modelled. It's important with any of these interludes that the facilitator or the tutor models the kind of behaviour that they want the students to engage in. So I've shared on Padlet a small amount of information about myself, mostly focusing on my role as the tutor in the course, but with some elements of my personal life as well. So I'm modelling that for the students in the hope that they will feel comfortable in sharing the same kind of material. The second type of playful interlude is a group builder. And the purpose of these is to quickly build groups or teams. Now, why are we building the groups or teams in the first place? The idea here is that you want smaller groups, breakout groups within your cohort, to create shared experiences, to help each other in the process of co-learning and to make memories together. And the idea also of a smaller group, a group builder for a smaller group, is to create natural organic conversation. So introductions happen in a much more natural and relaxed way. So it's not as formal as an icebreaker. And also to create a sense of group identity. So playful group builders can involve cooperation within the groups. It's worth noting that if you assign all the groups the same task, they're probably going to feel like they're competing with each other. So it's a trick to manage how much you want to embrace or disrupt that sense of competition. And if you set open-ended playful tasks, you can really encourage creativity here, and you might get a lot of very different outcomes, different playful responses to the task that enhance your learning outcomes. So some considerations. Are you going to have random groups or planned groups? and have a think about how that ensures inclusivity for everyone in the group. So you're going to disrupt the sort of natural groups that form, or are you going to embrace them? Now, one example here is students who don't have English as a first language, who are speaking in a second or third or even fourth language. Typically, I've found in my class that those students tend to group together. And I thought perhaps I should try and disrupt this and make it more kind of inclusive and spread people out across groups. But actually, if your English isn't that, if you're not that confident with speaking English, and you're in a group with 3 other very quick, very fluent English speakers, is that actually more inclusive for you? So you might want to think about, are you happy with randomly assigning using the breakout tools that we have access to, or do you want to plan these groups a little bit more? And if you're going to plan them, are you going to kind of embrace or try and disrupt the groups that students will naturally put themselves into? Competition, how much are you going to embrace or avoid competition? Competition can be really fruitful, it can be really fun, but it does need to be managed quite carefully to ensure that it doesn't become too serious. If there's any sense of long-term reward or disadvantage from winning or losing a competition, that can disrupt your learning outcomes. Think about the group identity. How is it going to be built? Do you have a theme for the course? Do you have a theme for the session? And how can you relate that theme to the activity outcomes that you have for this session? How much time are you going to let groups take in building this group identity? It is a very useful thing to have, a lovely sense of group cohesion. So how much time are you going to give the students to build that, and how are you going to ensure it doesn't take up too much time that should be devoted to other learning activities? So think about these links. Think about the links to the participation, the actual learning task that you're going to do with them in the session, and how you're going to link the group builder to those tasks. It could be thematically, or it could be in terms of behaviours and interactions. The idea here is you're trying to match as closely as possible the interlude behaviour with the learning behaviour. Okay, a terrible group builder. This is so bad. Who got the best grade on the last assignment? Okay, you two get to pick teams. That's an awful idea. I hope that nobody's ever experienced that. I'm going to talk briefly about what I think is a better group builder, which is an activity called Mini Epic Battle, which I adapted from a playful learning expert called Alex Moseley. So essentially, this is about building teams, and then the teams amalgamate in order to form bigger and bigger teams. And I use this in an activity which is about understanding group work and how to manage group work for students. I use it in a session with undergrads. So I like it because the group building activity is actually completely aligned with the learning outcomes for the course, which is how do you manage and work in teams. So very briefly, I will provide the rules separately to this presentation. But very briefly, each student as an individual designs a superhero. You could use Lego, you could just ask them to sketch it. The superhero has a name and a power, that's it, and a little physical sketch or Lego representation. Then you team them up simply based on where they're sitting, and you ask them to go into pairs, and then the superheroes battle, and they merge, they form an amalgam, and it might take some aspects of one superhero and some aspects of another superhero. Then you ask the pairs to group into groups of 4, and you do the same thing. Then you ask the groups of 4 to group into groups of 8, and you do the same thing. And then you finish with an epic battle of good versus evil, where they use their amalgamated superheroes, and you have a fairly arbitrary victor based on the interaction between the groups. So this is aligned to the pressures and the difficulties and the challenges of working in groups. And it also takes into considerations of group size, how easy it is to work in a group of 8 or a group of 16 versus a group of 4. And what I like about this activity is that nobody's contribution is forgotten. You know, that the superheroes are all amalgamated together. So there's always a sense of your cap wearing superhero might make it to the very end, even if everything else about him or her was discarded along the way. So everybody feels included. Another much simpler method, if you're just looking for a quick group build-up, would be to randomly assign using an online tool, or where the students are sitting, or letters in their names, anything like that. But then you allow them to choose a group identity that's themed to your activity. So it might be a team name of superheroes and a superhero power for that team, some kind of thematic thing, but whatever suits your particular learning outcomes. The third kind of interlude is energizers. The purpose of these is to really change the energy in a session. It's to re-engage every participant at an individual level, and also to wake students up a bit. If they've had a 45-minute online lecture, it would be useful to throw in an energizer before you do any more learning. So you can also use them to move to a different topic or a different mode of interaction. You can use energizers to consolidate or recap learning. You can refocus the session on a core outcome, really bring people back to what your single most important learning outcome for the session is. And you can also use them to get feedback. So there's a lot of overlap with an energizer. Playful energizers would almost always, in a face-to-face situation, involve physical movement. People getting up out of their chairs, moving around, getting the blood going again, and it puts them into a different mode of engagement than sitting and receiving information. Playful energizers can also include a lot of creative responses, again, to kind of change that mode of engagement, to move on to a different type of learning behavior. And it also allows people to practice behaviors with safe topics or silly topics that have no kind of long-term consequence. And you can then adapt those, apply those behaviors to the learning content. So considerations for energizers, I think these are the most challenging ones to replicate in the online environment, because they would normally involve some kind of physical or kinesthetic movement. You might also have a lot of props, which we cannot expect our students to have access to, even paper props. I don't have a printer at home. Many students won't either. So how can we replicate it in the online or hybrid environment? We need to think quite creatively about what we're going to do. Can we use digital surrogates to create that same energy without losing focus on the purpose of the energizer? Again, think about a range of roles for people who can't or don't want to participate in the standard way that you've chosen. There may be people who are not keen on throwing a ball around, for instance. I like that kind of energizer, but a lot of people absolutely hate it and feel very pressured and very made to feel very embarrassed if they drop the ball. Again, try and match the tone and content of the energizer to the learning outcomes. And how much, one way to think about energizers is how much you're going to actually flip it back onto the students. So how much you're going to involve peer learning or peer approval to demonstrate success at the task. So you want them to take ownership over it, but if you're going to ask people to hold something up, something they've made, or perform some physical activity, how much are you going to emphasize or de-emphasize the approval of the cohort in whether they've succeeded at your energizer task? So that needs to be handled quite carefully. So an example of a terrible energizer is, I've hidden the instructions for your next task somewhere in this building. Run and find them. Now, I've done one of these at a conference and I loved it, but it's a terrible energizer because it's excluding of anyone at all with mobility problems. It also is a bit dodgy in terms of health and safety. And also, if you hid it somewhere in the building and you're sharing that building with other people, it can be very disruptive for others. So you might be able to do something like that if you had full control over your space, but for this context, it's not a great energizer. And I mentioned the idea of some people being very, very nervous about anything involving physical dexterity. So catching a ball, for instance, especially if that's in front of a whole group. So if you're going to have something involving physical skills that people might not be happy with, then either create a safe space, perhaps in a smaller group, and do it within that safe space, or find a way to make failure just as rewarding as success at the task. Okay, some ideas for better energizers. Again, these are just my ideas. I'm happy to take criticism or feedback of them. One thing I did in my class when I taught face-to-face is I had my students get up out of their chairs and stand on an imaginary line in terms of the risk, the ethical risk of their project ideas. So on one side, it was zero risk, absolutely nothing risky at all about this project. And on the other side, it's, yes, I'm working with human tissue and it's very, very risky. And I asked the students to line up. Then I taught the material about ethics and risk. And then I asked them to do the task again so that they could see how they move along that line. And almost every student kind of moves towards the, oh, it's actually more risky than I thought end of the scale. So how might I replicate this in an online environment? Well, I could ask the students to hold up a hand, very risky, medium risky, not so risky. It's not very energizing, but it is a way of moving, and it gives, more importantly, it gives the tutor a really quick visual sense of what the students think about a topic just by using levels. Another idea I had, again, I'm happy to receive feedback about this, is to buy a lot of seed bombs. And if we ever get back to teaching face to face, when a student demonstrates they've completed a certain task, I would issue them with a seed bomb and a catapult, and they would get to catapult the seed bomb into the bit of waste ground next to our building. And then over the spring term, they could see the flowers grow. And I like this idea because I think what we're missing in a hybrid and online environment is a sense of connection to the place of learning and the city itself. So I quite like the idea of that. I'll let you know how it goes. Simply put, online, you could have something different, like get an object from your house, look out of your window, post an emoji in the chat, even if you don't want people to get up out of their seats. All of these things could be considered to be energizers because they're changing the focus, they're changing the energy and the behaviors in the room. So again, if you had an object from the house, you have to be careful about asking people to share more than they're comfortable with. So you leave it completely within their control. They might just share the cup that they're keeping next to their computer, for instance. The final type is consolidators. So what's the purpose of a consolidator? It's in the name, really. It's to allow the students to reflect on what they've learned, to share their thoughts about the session with the cohort, with the other students or within groups, and to really deepen and consolidate the learning of the session. Consolidators are also really, really good at cementing intentions. So allowing students to explicitly form an action plan of what they're going to do next. You can also use a consolidation activity to get feedback from your students. If you are collecting feedback, perhaps at the end of a course, or even on a single session, perhaps that you've never run that way before, you might want to collect feedback. And if this is the last time you're going to see people, it's the last class of a course, for instance, you can kind of make this consolidator about parting ways. So about looking back, celebrating the learning that's been done or the activities that have happened in the session, and just rounding off the whole event. Playful consolidators maximize participation by increasing the fun of the activity. They can enthuse participants for future action, so they can really kind of add to this motivation of what a student is going to go away and do after the session. They can help people to stay in touch if that's relevant or useful. Again, in a repeated class, that might not be so relevant, but at the end of a course or the end of a conference, you have to give people the option to share and to stay in touch and to keep building on the benefits of the conference after they leave. And also to celebrate the activity, to celebrate the learning that's been done. So considerations for consolidators: how often and when to do them. Are you going to do one at the end of every class, at the end of every topic within the class, just at the end of the course? So when are you going to do them? How are you going to recap learning content? And you're almost certainly already doing this, going over the kind of core learning outcomes for each session in a slide at the end, for instance. So is there a way that we can make these consolidators more playful, more engaging for the students? Consolidators, can they be asynchronous as we go into this hybrid learning environment? I think it's something that's quite a good candidate for being asynchronous, so you don't necessarily have to run them face to face. And if you're going to do them asynchronously, how are you going to encourage full participation? Consolidators can also provide a really good link to the wider context, so that the teaching and learning outside your individual course or outside your small group within that course, for instance. So how can you link it? How can you really encourage this motivational tone and encourage students to take away what they've learned and actually apply it elsewhere? And finally, of course, how can you use them to increase feedback that's useful for you and to improve your future delivery, but also recognizes that the students have valuable contributions to make that are valued by the tutors and will be taken on board. So a terrible consolidator, I couldn't really think of anything worse than doing nothing, just like, right, 1 minute to 11, we're done, bye, see you next week. So please consolidate a bit in whatever way that you're doing already, but let's think about how we can really enhance them in terms of playful consolidators. So just a very quick example, a conference I went to, asked people to fill in their feedback forms for the conference, but then make them into a paper aeroplane and throw them at the front of the room in order to create a bit of fun and to increase the engagement. And of course, if you get chance to fold up a paper aeroplane and throw it at the conference organizers, you're absolutely going to do that more than if somebody just leaves it on your desk and asks you to fill it in. And it also creates this kind of celebration, you know, the air full of paper planes flying over the seats as they kind of playfully return their feedback forms. So I thought that was a really good example of a consolidator to encourage feedback. Now, you might have noticed during these slides that there's something over there called the odd one out game, and we'll return to that at the very end. So I'm going to start wrapping up. Things to definitely avoid in interludes. Anything involved touching another person should go without saying, but it doesn't necessarily. Even without a global pandemic, this is a bad idea. You don't want to force people into physical contact that they're not comfortable with. Anything involving too serious a sense of competition. Group builders are all about creating a sense of us and them, but it should be a kind of playful, happy, collaborative sense. It shouldn't be there shouldn't be any kind of winner or any situation that might result in gloating or people feeling like they've failed. So watch out for anything that's too competitive. Anything that excludes people based on physical dexterity, quick wits, social anxiety, cultural background. So you have to think really critically about the interludes that you might already have in your course or that you might be wanting to put in. You know, the ball game, I love it, but not everybody does. So I need to avoid things that are going to exclude anybody based on any of these factors. Try and avoid anything that doesn't have an opt-out for people who just don't want to participate in the core activity, and make that role a valid role. You know, give the observers something specific to do so that they still feel included, but they don't have to toss a ball around if they don't want to. And of course, anything that expects participants to reveal too personal information, bearing in mind that if you're asking people to move around their home spaces or show items from their houses, you need to make it really clear that it's up to them to share as much as they would like. Overall considerations then. Who are the audience and what behaviours do you want from them? Undergrads, postgrads, graduates, conference people, other scholars, peers, people you've never met before. What behaviours do you want and who are they? Okay. How can setting relevant tasks lead to organic bonding and organic social support without necessarily doing a kind of lengthy and unmeaningful icebreaker? If you've been using interludes already, playful or otherwise, if you've been using them for years, it's really worth stepping back and taking a critical look at the form of the interlude and using this change in our teaching behaviours as a chance to reassess. Does it do what you want? Does it achieve exactly what you want it to do? Is there any way that you could make it more fun, more motivating, or better aligned to the outcomes of your session? So critically question anything you're doing already. And I do encourage you to embrace playful interludes and playful challenges, because they can remove some of the barriers to learning that people might have, and they can really help, especially in terms of social bonding, which is such a challenge right now. They can help students to bond in an unforced and natural way. Okay, so finally, if you noticed throughout the slides, there were little pictures with a label saying odd one out game. This is an idea that I've never tried before, and I'd be glad to hear if you think it works. So if this was a live session, I would be asking the students now to tell me which image is the odd one out. So have a go at that. And if you have any feedback on this particular consolidator, please do let me know. That's it. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this helpful, and my email is on the slide at the start of this video. So please do get in touch if you have any questions or you want to give me any feedback. Thank you very much. Bye.